Welcome to Talk Wave, making waves, one talk at a time.
All right, so let's dive into the spending bill. This 1,547 page spending bill. It's been causing a lot of frustration lately and a lot of head scratching.
Yeah, I think the thing that's so striking is the sheer density of it. 1,547 pages, packed with all sorts of things, allocations, provisions, and a lot of things that just leave you wondering, wait, what?
Yeah, and amidst all of this,
Huh.
there are a few things that really jump out. Imagine you're a hurricane victim. You're struggling to rebuild your life,
Yeah.
and you hear that there's this huge spending bill, and you're thinking, okay, finally some help might be on the way. And then you find out that it includes a hefty pay raise for the very people who can't seem to agree on anything, let alone, actually provide timely disaster relief.
It really does make you question where the priorities are. On one hand, you have these communities that are devastated by natural disasters, and they need help. They need aid to get back on their feet. And then on the other hand, you have Congress voting to give themselves a raise, the first one since 2009.
It's like they're living in a completely different world. And to add insult to injury, there's this whole section in the bill about legal protections. For members of Congress,
Yeah.
it's vague, it's concerning. It makes you wonder, what are they trying to shield themselves from?
The lack of transparency surrounding this is really troubling. It mentions protection from prosecution related to official duties, but what exactly does that encompass? The language is so broad that it could potentially be used to justify all sorts of things.
It's like, trust us, we need these protections, but we're not going to tell you why.
Right.
And that just breeds suspicion, especially when you consider this bill was rushed through right before the holidays. It's almost like they were hoping it would slip under the radar.
The timing and the lack of transparency definitely raise red flags. It creates this impression that they were trying to avoid public scrutiny and just kind of push this through.
Okay, so we've got a bill that's hard to decipher. It's packed with provisions that seem more focused on protecting those in power than helping those in need. And then there's the whole stadium funding thing.
Yeah.
That feels like the cherry on top of this frustrating sundae.
Right. In the midst of all of this, we have allocation for transferring the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium site to make way for a new stadium for the Washington Commanders.
It's like, hey, enjoy the game while your house is being rebuilt.
It just highlights this disconnect between, the priorities of those in power and the reality.
Yeah, and it leaves you wondering, what are they thinking?
It's a question worth exploring further, and that's exactly what we're going to do as we continue to dive deeper into this controversial spending bill. It's mind-boggling. The audacity of prioritizing a football stadium when you have people who are struggling to put their lives back together after a hurricane.
Yeah, and this whole thing with the legal protections for Congress. I mean, it's just like they're saying, we need to protect ourselves from something, but we're not going to tell you what.
Yeah, the lack of specificity is what's so concerning. It's fueling all sorts of speculation.
It's a scary thought, especially when you think about how this bill was rushed through without much scrutiny. Like they were trying to sneak these things in under the cover of holiday chaos.
Absolutely. The lack of transparency, the hasty process are major red flags. And it's not just the legal protections and the stadium funding that are raising eyebrows. The whole bill is riddled with what critics are calling pork barrel spending.
Yeah, and we keep talking about this 1,547 page monstrosity of a bill. But I think it's important to highlight WHY that matters. It's not just about the sheer volume of paper. It's about the fact that a document this massive is practically impossible for anyone to fully comprehend, let alone scrutinize for questionable allocations.
You're right. The sheer lengths and complexity of this bill make it incredibly difficult to hold anyone accountable.
Yeah, and it plays right into the hands of those who benefit from a lack of transparency.
Exactly.
It's infuriating, and it contributes to this growing sense of disconnect between the people and their government.
It does. This disconnect is a real threat to our democracy.
Yeah, and that's exactly what those who benefit from this system want. They want us to be so disillusioned and overwhelmed that we just give up.
Right. And we can't let that happen. We need to stay informed, stay engaged, and keep holding those in power accountable.
Easier said than done when you're dealing with a 1,547 page behemoth of a bill.
It's certainly a challenge. But that's why we're here to break it down, to shine a light on the questionable aspects and empower you with the knowledge you need to make your voice heard.
Okay, so we've talked about the lack of transparency, the questionable legal protections, the frustrating pay raise, and the sense of disconnect between Congress and the people they represent. But let's circle back to the disaster relief funding for a moment. Because while that $100 billion figure might sound impressive at first glance, there's more to the story than meets the eye.
Right. It's important to put that number into context.
Yeah.
When you consider the scope of the recent hurricane damage, the increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, and the long-term infrastructure needs facing the country, that $100 billion starts to look a lot less impressive.
Yeah, it's like trying to patch up a sinking ship with a roll of duct tape. Sure, it might hold for a little while, but it's not a sustainable solution.
Exactly. It highlights a lack of long-term vision.
And it brings us back to that fundamental question of priorities. If Congress can find the money to fund a new stadium, why can't they fully fund the recovery and rebuilding efforts for communities that have been devastated by natural disasters?
It's a matter of fairness, justice, and the fundamental responsibility of government to protect and care for its citizens.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, this spending bill isn't just about numbers on a page. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, and their futures.
And it's about demanding that our government prioritize those needs over special interests and political maneuvering.
We can't allow ourselves to become numb to these kinds of injustices.
We need to keep shining a light on the discrepancies, calling out the hypocrisy, and demanding better.
We need to remember that we, the people, have the power to shape the priorities of our government.
But it requires us to be informed, engaged, and vocal.
It requires us to demand transparency, accountability, and a commitment to serving the public good. So as we continue to dive deeper into this controversial spending bill, let's keep those principles in mind. Because the decisions being made in Washington have a direct impact on our lives. And we have a right to demand that those decisions reflect our values and our priorities. We've been talking about this disconnect, between Congress and the people they represent. And I think this spending bill really drives that point home. It's like they're operating on a different planet. We're giving themselves a raise while hurricane victims struggle to get basic necessities seems perfectly logical.
It's a disconnect that's fueled by a lack of transparency, and a system that often prioritizes special interests over the needs of everyday Americans. And I think that's what's so frustrating about this whole situation.
Yeah, it feels like a betrayal of trust. Like we elect these people to represent us to make decisions that benefit the country as a whole. And then they turn around and do something like this. It's enough to make you want to throw your hands up and say, what's the point?
I understand that feeling. It's easy to get cynical when you see things like this happening, but I think it's important to remember that we, the people, still have a voice. We can't let ourselves become apathetic or disengaged.
So what can we actually do about it? It feels like shouting into the void sometimes.
It's not about shouting. It's about being informed, engaged, and persistent. First and foremost, we need to educate ourselves about what's actually in these bills. Don't just rely on headlines or sound bites. Dig deeper, read the details, and understand the implications of the decisions being made.
Knowledge is power, right? The more we know, the better equipped we are to hold our elected officials accountable.
Exactly. And once you're informed, don't be afraid to make your voice heard. Contact your representatives, attend town hall meetings, write letters to the editor. Let them know that you're paying attention and that you expect them to prioritize the needs of their constituents.
It's about reminding them that they work for U.S., not the other way around.
Absolutely.
And that their decisions have real-world consequences for real people.
And don't underestimate the power of collective action. Connect with like-minded individuals, join advocacy groups, and participate in organized efforts to push for change.
There's strength in numbers. When people come together and demand better, those in power are more likely to listen.
It's about creating a groundswell of public pressure that can't be ignored. It's about reminding those in power that they are accountable to the people they represent.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into this controversial spending bill, I think the takeaway is this. We can't afford to be complacent. We need to stay informed, engaged, and vocal. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and a government that prioritizes the needs of its citizens over special interests.
And we need to remember that change is possible. It might not happen overnight, but with persistence and a collective commitment to holding those in power accountable, we can create a system that truly reflects the values and priorities of the American people.
That's it for our deep dive into this frustrating, confusing, and frankly infuriating spending bill. We hope this episode has provided you with some insights, sparked some healthy debate, and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, the power to create change lies within each and every one of us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.